I'm supposed to do a kind of a top-down look at the forces at work in the global economy and financial markets that affect entrepreneurs and in fact people like you, people who finance them, people who want to do new things. And to some extent, there are certain things that go on at the macro level, the global level, in the national level having to do with monetary, fiscal policy, government regulation formation, the legal systems, and so on, that you're indifferent to. I mean, you just take it for granted that you make some money, they're going to tax you. You take for granted that if you have to borrow some money, you're going to have to pay somebody some interest. And you'd rather have low rather than high interest rates. You'd rather have a high stock market rather than a low stock market, but not too high a stock market today because you're still in the acquiring mode. But when you want to do an exit strategy, you sure want that stock market to be very high. So that's all taken for granted. But in the meantime, you're mostly live and die by the quality of your own management, your own partners, the quality of your products and the technology behind them, and the, shall we say, the loyalty of your customers. How you keep that loyalty depending on how well you produce the products and whether you tell them the truth. But it's still very important. And I think it affects a lot of attitudes of the investor community generally and the business community generally about how to invest, where to invest, how much to invest based on these more macro developments. So I've started off by writing a list of, the speech title is Challenges and Opportunities. And they made me turn off my cell phone, so I don't have a clock or a watch in front of me. So Jan's requirement is to come and saddle up to the podium here when I've got about 5 minutes to go, so I will stop on time because you've got other things to do. Let me just go through a few of the challenges that I think we share, the U.S. and Europe, U.S., Germany and Europe, and challenges that are maybe more unique to one or another of us. And then I'd like to dwell on some opportunities. And I wrote down the list of opportunities before I got here, did it a few days ago. And you will think that I simply took notes from some of these company presentations, because they are on my list, not by company, but by the thrust of it. And then I'll take some questions. But I have a kind of a spy, since it's in our blood now, in the audience who knows a lot about many things and is basically my friendliest critic. A friend and critic is something rare. They should be treasured. And I'll be able to call on him as a commentator if I don't see immediately 2 or 3 hands. That's up to you. Okay, challenges. Immigration. In the U.S., the immigration issue is still largely about Latin America, about drug cartels in Mexico, about basically the way the U.S. Runs an immigration policy that is based on family relationships rather than skills and professional competence. In other words, we're different than Canada, which puts a primary emphasis on bringing in immigrants with skills, and they bring in a lot, and only secondarily family relationships, and we flip it around in the U.S., and that leads to quite a lot of struggle in the Congress, and also a lot of rhetoric about what we should be doing to keep illegal immigration at as low level as possible. The immigration problem in Europe has been highlighted by these tremendous, you would call humanitarian factors. That is less of a factor in the U.S. It's clearly the factor in Europe, and it's going to create tremendous political strains. It already is. It's always amazing for those of us who have been lucky enough to meet Frau Merkel, Kanzlerin Merkel, how shrewd she is, how far-sighted she is, what good judgment she has. But boy, this one's a toughie for her to handle. And throughout Europe, there is this, I would say, almost certainly understandable and utterly predictable impact at a 10%, 11% unemployment rate throughout the European community. Now, it's not that high in Germany, of course, certainly not that high in Austria, but it is that high in many other countries or higher. And I think that this is one of the main factors that makes that, I would say, the hardest issue for Europe to solve, and I'm not all that optimistic we'll solve our own problems either. The European challenge on the Greek debt crisis, which certainly have overwhelmed the headlines for not such a long period of time ago, and its contagion to Spain, to Portugal, to Ireland, even a little bit to Italy, and maybe even France. I think that through Merkel and others' actions, including Draghi at the European Central Bank, that's definitely on the back burner. Spain particularly is showing very decent economic numbers. The latest number I saw for Spain for 2015, the year we're in, is a growth rate of somewhere around 4%, and even higher than 4% for industrial production. So Spain has done a lot of things that were worthwhile. The Portuguese have definitely moved ahead. Greece is still struggling, but it's no longer this clear threat to the stability of the European community. And to that sense, this has been a much tougher challenge for Europe, for the European community, for the Eurozone, than in the United States. And I must say the United States response has been very passive. The U.S. is a lender into the Greek debt thing because it's part of the IMF slice of the tripartite loans. But it generally has had very little to say about how the Greek thing should be resolved, other than Europe should continue to keep lending to it. But that hasn't really been a decisive factor in European thinking or German thinking. But I'd say that's one challenge met and basically under control. Just cross our fingers. But the challenge that Europe meets that the U.S. is only starting to come to grips with is Russian aggressiveness. This has been around for a while. It happened first in Georgia, then people didn't pay much attention to it. It's not new that Russia puts pressure on Ukraine. They did it back in 2000 with cutting off the gas supplies, and they've been sort of nipping at the Ukrainians' heels ever since. But this next and more elevated aggression, where there are thousands of Russian tanks and mortars and all kinds of artillery being shipped in and then being used, and many people being killed as a result, this is a new phase. And what the Russians are now doing in Syria, it isn't directly affecting Europe in an economic sense, but it certainly is affecting Europe in terms of the tens of thousands of potential and actual immigrants, refugees, that are escaping the fighting, in which hundreds of thousands of people are dead. This is terrible. Now, whether the Russian sort of vision of what they can accomplish is right or not, I'm not qualified to say, but I'll tell you one thing, it is a challenge, and we're going to have to, the West generally, but particularly the European part of the West, is going to have to deal with this for some years to come. Putin is around, and he has a different view of what's right and what's wrong than most of us have. The U.S. is what I would say ambivalent about how tough to be. It's been quite tough, with quite a lot of support in Europe, for economic sanctions. A lot of European and particularly German businessmen are getting tired of them. They would prefer to make the sales. It's certainly having an impact on the Russian economy. The ruble is, we were in St. Petersburg on a college alumni tour in August, and it's really cheap. The ruble is so depreciated that St. Petersburg, I don't know, it's not really very much Russia, but it certainly is an enormously interesting tourist destination, and eating in the restaurants and drinking in the bars and going to the various sites is not expensive compared to anything in Europe. So that tells us that, yes, the sanctions are having a big impact, not perfect, but they certainly aren't changing Russian geopolitical strategy or policies. And And there is almost the threat that this tremendous cohesion among the NATO countries and others could fray. So this is a big challenge. But there are a couple other challenges that we do share directly, and the most important of is the role of China in the world economy. We saw it so vividly, almost theatrically, in the movement of the various stock markets just in the last month or two. If you would have told anybody 10 years ago that a change in a Chinese economic growth forecast would trigger 30% and 40% declines in stock markets all over the world within days, you would have been considered idiotic. How in the world would that matter? It's still hard to really come to grips with the severity of that impact. But there are a lot of reasoned considerations. A lot of countries depend very heavily on trade with China. Number one is in terms of the actual share of Chinese exports to China by different countries as a share of their GDP. Number one is Malaysia. Number two is South Korea. Thailand is on that list. And if you look at Thai economic statistics, their industrial production is down 10% this year. The Japanese industrial production is down. So anybody producing copper, because China uses half of the world's copper these days, are down. That includes South America and others, some in Africa. Brazilian's economy is a bit of a recession, partly because of the lower commodity prices, and that's partly due to Chinese lessened demand. Chinese import figures for August just came out yesterday, down 13%. Now that's largely prices, because prices of commodities have fallen, but it also shows that the Chinese economy is sputtering because Chinese exports are also down 5% from a year ago. Very rare over the last few years. So it's not silly to think that if China catches a cold, the rest of us get the flu. We used to say that about, or the Mexicans used to say that about the United States. You know, too close to God, too close to the United States, and too far from God. That was what the Mexicans thought. Now the Malaysians and the Thais and the Indonesians are wondering whether that degree of integration with the Chinese economy is really good for them. But stock markets all over the place with even mild connection to China, like Turkey's, have also gone down. So that's a common challenge. How about politics? Well, Europe has all these different countries. The politics of Germany are quite stable in holding coalitions together, maybe even better than when she had more of a unfettered majority. We don't have anything like that in the U.S. We have split government. It was done on purpose by the founding fathers, but it's never been this split in quite a number of years. And I don't know how it gets resolved. There's a fiscal policy standoff over whether we should have a balanced budget. If we have a balanced budget, how should it be fixed? Through taxes. Different parts of the U.S. government, can you have cuts in spending? Well, you can't touch the entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, and so on. So you're left with less than half of the budget spending to really play with. And right now we're on course. I hope it doesn't happen, but it very likely will, with our fourth government shutdown in 20 years, maybe fifth. And this one will be as inconvenient and maybe nasty as cannot come to grips with making a coalition that works on terms of the budget. We also have tremendous differences in perceptions and actual behavior toward regulatory activism. To put it, oversimplify it, the Democrats are now in a regulatory high, more regulations, more pushing of the law, not always getting away with it. There's been court case that went the other way for the administration on water regulations just yesterday, day before yesterday. The Republicans would like to get rid of a lot of regulations, but there are mountains of them, and if you try to pin down which is the 5 or 6 most important ones to relax or remove, you get about 90 different answers depending on which members of Congress you talk to. So there's no real cohesion between the Congress, now Republican, and the administration, Democrat, or within each of the two parties about what to do. Now, some people say, well, fractured government is no problem for Wall Street. Well, it is and it isn't. And it would be better for business planning if anybody could plan ahead to what kind of government policies will come out of the next administration that gets voted in just about a year from now. But right now, the business planning is handicapped in the U.S. How about in Europe? Is that similarly there? Well, you have you have Germany with virtually no budget deficit, with plenty of latitude to do whatever it likes on fiscal policy, but wedded to the balanced budget concept, and I can't say they're wrong. Other parts of Europe would prefer Germany to be more of a what should we say, a philanthropist. How that works out is yet to be seen. So that leaves me with monetary policy. Monetary policy in both Europe and the United States is a collective action. In other words, there's no single individual, despite the fact that the press generally says it's a Greenspan or a Bernanke or now Janet Yellen that dictates monetary policy. There are countries that have that. Canada, for example, has a governor, and the governor makes the decisions. He has advisors, but it's constitutionally one person's decision. But like the European Central Bank, which was formed in the image of the U.S. Fed, these are collective, shall we say, collegiate decisions. And basically, good Fed chairmen can nudge the others in a direction that he or she wants, but really is not determinative if he or she can't hold the majority of the group with them. And that's where we stand in the U.S. We have two good positions, either to tighten monetary policy a little or don't touch it. Nobody's arguing for tightening monetary policy a lot because we don't have any inflation. Even though we got a 5% recorded unemployment rate, we got 10% if you take away, if you count in all the discouraged workers, because our participation rate is very low. So if you took account of that, we'd have a 10% inflation rate, unemployment rate, not very different than Europe's. But 5% means that maybe labor markets are tighter, but nobody wants to have very more sharply tightened. Now, in the wake of that Chinese flare-up, the stock market decline, pleased by the IMF and the World Bank, the Fed kept monetary policy on hold. They won't do that forever. The economy needs higher interest rates for all kinds of good reasons. For one thing, it's overly subsidizing risk-taking at the expense of ordinary people, and particularly elderly people, who they're the people that are scared. They've kept their money in the bank at very low interest rates. They've bought treasury bills at almost zero interest rates. And that really is, over a period of time, just unfair, because it's essentially a manufactured price by the Fed imposed on the public. But getting from a zero interest rate for the federal funds rate up to 1 or 2%, which, believe me, will not kill the U.S. economy, but might kill the stock market and the commodity markets and the emerging markets' ability to borrow, that's why they're very hesitant to move. So don't expect very much. There's an appeal by some of the emerging markets at the latest meeting in Lima, Peru, to get it over with, tighten now. But I can assure all those people, if the Fed tightens once, it won't stop. And they better be careful what they wish for. Now here's Draghi and the European Central Bank sitting over here where Europe is in less strong economic position. Germany's growth rate now is about 1.5%, almost identical to the overall Eurozone economic growth rate of about 1.5%. I would say not bad, but certainly, and that it should be higher. I mean, there's no reason why Europe can't grow more with big unemployment rates. There can't be any real impact on labor market tightness. And you know, they could do more, but they already have interest rates as low as they can. So Europe could use a dose of fiscal stimulus too, and isn't going to happen. So I think we're sort of stuck in this regime of very cheap money and very little dynamic investment growth by the business community for some time to come. Now, what does that mean for innovators, for entrepreneurs? Well, guess what? Not a lot, because in this kind of situation, how do you make money if you're an established business and an established industry? You cut costs. How do you cut costs? You go to the innovators and the high-tech people who look at what you're doing that's not quite first class, that's not quite efficient, and you go to them to help you do things better, and you make more profits. You go to people that can improve your use of global supply chains. You look for ways to save costs on suppliers, sometimes Chinese joint venture partners. Anything to try to lower the costs at a time where the overall demand is not entirely supportive of fast growth and profits. So if you're in the kind of businesses where you're serving clients that want to do something better and more efficient, you're in this room. And so even though I'm not painting an enormously bullish attitude toward the macro conditions, I'm also telling you there's no pressure on anybody to make life worse for you by tightening policy. Inflation's not going anywhere soon. The low commodity prices, particularly energy prices, are certainly very useful for Europe and all others who have to import energy. And you know, by and large, the stock markets, despite these enormous volatile movements, like your sectors. And that gives you more opportunities. So I'm very optimistic about people here and the people that you work with, because even in a kind of grumpy period for the markets as a whole, people want what you can do for them. That's the future. So thanks very much. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
We do a lot of visualization work.
Yes.
How do you see big data and risk factoring into all of this as we're looking not just more global, but also to diversify?
Well, some of it that's already been done is very helpful. I think it's cool when you go on Amazon, you find out that people who wanted to buy that book on China have also wanted to buy the following 6 books. I think that that's like having a friend in the library. That's not really big data, though. The kind of big data that we worked at when I was at the National Intelligence Council, I was of two minds about. Basically, I thought it would get us in trouble. And I think that there has to be limits on it. And I think there has to be limits on the use of it by industry. On the other hand, you can't rule it out entirely. How in the world can you have modern timetables for railroad systems without using big data? How in the world could you possibly run the world's hotel industry without being able to beef up the cost of a hotel room in Munich by 3 times, whether or not there's Oktoberfest or a Messe fair, right? So everybody does that. The airlines change prices every 10 minutes when you try to buy a cheap airfare ticket. So that's all based on big data, and they're manipulating that data. And I don't think there's any, as long as it's anonymous big data, I have no problem. But where it stops being anonymous and starts being abused, governments are going to come down very heavy-handed on it, and a lot of money will be wasted trying to do things that's on the edge of what I would call common sense, shall we say, respect for privacy. Sir, Rob Hauk? Oh, yeah. It's on my list. TTIP is a challenge of our own making, our meaning European and America. TTIP started because the U.S. really did want to tilt toward Asia and really got behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. And the administration made it a bedrock goal to get TPP. Europe felt left out. Europe had the Greek crisis. Europe had slow growth and high unemployment and felt, well, if this thing's going to work for the U.S. and Asia, we better get on board. And TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, had a big I investment in a small t trade because there are very few trade barriers between Europe and the U.S. now. Some, but easily fixed through quiet negotiations rather than a big round. Right now, TPP is very, very to me, surprisingly controversial in the U.S., and now we have Hillary Clinton coming out against it, against her own president. This shows you how controversial it is and how many votes there are in being against trade agreements. If Hillary Clinton's getting away with being against it in the U.S., similarly placed politicians in Europe will be against TTIP. Some because they don't like the kind of arbitration rules or proposals, others for other reasons. So I think that it's going to be very difficult, and I would say impossible, before November 10th of next year. Maybe after the election where things are clarified, we could have some movement on TPP, the Pacific version of it, right after the election. You might be able to get a bipartisan compromise. TTIP is too far in advance. It's not advanced enough, and it won't go that soon. I don't think it'll ever be off the table. I think it's basically a good idea. I also think that making these big deals with lots of trade-offs, what you guarantee you is the people that are hurt by the trade-offs will complain, and the people who benefit will keep their mouth shut. One more question, and then I think I've run out of time. Yes? And you have been enormously patient with me. Thank you. Go ahead.
How do you think that the whole refugee immigration issue in Germany will affect the economic prospect of Germany? Will it be positive, negative?
Yeah, anything that happens in a hurry, a very short period of time, bad things will happen. Somebody will turn out to be a crook. There will be fights or something with police. Something bad will happen, and the public will turn off of it. If the same number of people were integrated, much like some of the Eastern Europeans who came to Germany, but they came in over a period of time. They can come in overnight. The Turks who came as guest workers, many of them stayed. They're fully integrated. The only time that you hear of any problems is their horns all night when Turkey beats Germany in some European Cup match. That's the only time you actually notice it in Munich. Maybe also in Berlin, sometimes more than that. So that's very hard to deal with. Now, the smart thing to do would be to set up stagings. So it doesn't all show up in Germany in a month or even a year. That it goes in phases with other countries cooperating. I don't know, but that requires a lot of political, shall we say, tact. So I don't think it's going to have a happy ending. But in terms of economic growth, though, it's definitely going to be positive. There are going to be a number of people from a place like Syria who are highly talented. At the very worst, they can be hired by German international companies because they know languages and they know people in the Gulf. So there's a lot of human capital that will come along that will be very pro-growth. But in the meantime, it's just the sheer numbers of it that will overwhelm common sense, and that's I'm afraid. Let me just rattle off, before I step off, some of the opportunities, though. Anything having to do with the aging of the baby boom makes sense. Now, we've heard about the Parkinson's disease approach. I have a friend who has it very badly. This was a classical concert pianist who got Parkinson's, and he had to stop playing. He continues to compose, but now he fell down, broke his hip, broke his shoulders, in the hospital right now, even with the better medicine. This is a godsend. Macular degeneration, my father had it in his 80s, and let me tell you, it's going to happen to everybody after their 80s. That's an important one. Hearing, we've talked about. Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are all part of the same ball of wax. Aging equals opportunity for businesses. Cyber intrusion, I spent a lot of time in my 3 years down in Langley working on cyber problems. My co-conspirator, Rick Leggett, is now the #2 at NSA. Most of the business community has ignored it. People that are going to come in and basically shake them by the shoulders and get them to realize what's going to be a great opportunity. German companies, Bavarian companies are going to be in the forefront. I'm very, very happy what I'm hearing here. This is not a place where I have to plead with people to take cyber intrusion seriously. Water, clean water, the world needs it. Technology can do it. It can be done much better than it's doing now. It's a great opportunity. Why Siemens sold its water purification, water enhancement, desalinization is beyond belief to me. If they were here today, I'd say, why in the world, this great opportunity, why would you want to go away from that? It seems to me crazy, but maybe Siemens knows best. Additive manufacturing. There's not one way of doing it. Additive manufacturing is a whole host of different technologies, but it really is going to shorten. My brother just left Solar Turbines in San Diego as a PhD in material sciences, and he ran their engineering and product development thing, and he created a single crystal. They make things that look like jet engines that do other things, like natural gas pipeline compressors and cogeneration equipment and so on. And he made a single part, the things that whirl around, out of a single crystal. Very high, Berkeley PhDs can do that sort of thing. That's the kind of thing that will hit. Now, you said, what about additive? Well, we did the prototype, and this was 20 years ago. We did the prototype in the infancy of additive manufacturing. Instead of cutting up the metal, you build it up in a mold and then cast a crystal. Fantastic. All kinds, and Bavaria particularly is full of companies in tool and die and that kind of metalworking thing. They're going to use it as BMW does now. You go into a BMW factory in Munich today, you don't see any people. You see robots, you see all kinds of people, all kinds of things that seem to be working by themselves, but they're not. The quality control and the computer programming and the development of specialized chips to make the robots work better, that's what's going on, and that's what Bavaria is good at. And finally, the next generation of two systems. Systems are important because they require lots of different kinds of inputs from different methodologies and different professional backgrounds. One is the healthcare delivery system. It's a mess, maybe not in Germany, but the rest of Europe and certainly in the US, and much entrepreneurial skill will be used to make it better. And finally, in terms of public transportation. I mean, Uber is really cool. There's no doubt about it. My partner, Craig Drill, does it all the time now, and he only heard about it about 6 months ago, and it's great, particularly at rush hour in New York City. So all kinds of new entrepreneurial ways of getting people around crowded, congested cities. Fantastic, and it saves a lot of money to move a mile of subway track in New York City is $20 billion. Let's go for Uber. Thanks for your attention. Go make money.